He had broken the Senate and buried the Republic at Pharsalus. He chased the greatest rival Rome had ever produced across the length of the Mediterranean. Gaius Julius Caesar arrived at the shores of Alexandria as the undisputed master of the known world. He received the severed head of his rival and the ring that had sealed 1,000 dispatches. And now his men were digging holes in the courtyard. Not for fortifications, not for siege works, for water. The subterranean canals feeding the palace had been diverted. The cisterns had turned brackish. The soldiers who had conquered Gaul were on their knees in the dirt, pressing their palms into the dust. They were searching for groundwater in the palace of the pharaohs. Outside the walls, 20,000 men waited. Inside, a eunuch with a stack of papyrus scrolls was winning. When a conqueror finally corners his greatest rival, does he expect absolute victory or a severed head? On the shores of Alexandria, the undisputed master of Rome was met not with a glorious surrender, but with a gruesome gift that shattered his triumph. Trapped within a foreign palace, besieged by bureaucratic poison and brackish wells, the invincible Roman legions were slowly suffocating. With 20,000 hostile soldiers massing outside, a bloodless, invisible assassination was closing in on Julius Caesar. Amidst this collapsing dignity, an exiled queen risked her life, wrapped in coarse fabric, to stand before the mourning dictator. Will this desperate midnight pact forge a new golden age, or drag them both into a catastrophic war of ashes? The blood of the Republic. The Mediterranean waters slapped the timber of the Roman galley. Salt crystallized along the iron cleats. In the fading warmth of autumn, late September in the year 48 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar stood at the prow. He watched the shoreline of Alexandria cut the horizon. The sun struck the limestone of the Pharos lighthouse, and the heat distorted the air above the flat, blue expanse of the harbor. The Mediterranean world had been fractured by a devastating civil war. Following his cataclysmic defeat at the Battle of Pharsalus, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, attempted to find refuge on the shores of Pelusium, Egypt. He did not find sanctuary. On the orders of the regents managing the adolescent boy king Ptolemy XIII, Pompey was assassinated by Lucius Septimius and Achillas. The Egyptian court calculates that by eliminating Julius Caesar's last great rival, they will earn the favor of the victor. On October 2, 48 BC, the distant horizon beyond the great harbor of Alexandria darkened with the intimidating sails of a new Roman fleet. Julius Caesar, the undisputed master of the Republic, arrived at the harbor of Alexandria. His war galleys cut through the water with the unstoppable grace of an eagle, his battle-scarred legionaries standing ready on the wooden decks. Caesar had chased Pompey relentlessly across the sea. He was driven by the consuming, absolute need to finalize the civil war and bring his former ally to heel. He fully expected to find his rival regrouping, gathering new armies, and preparing for another desperate, honorable clash of Roman arms. His massive flagship dropped anchor beneath the towering, legendary shadow of the Pharos lighthouse. A delegation of opulent Egyptian dignitaries rode out to meet the conqueror. Men in fine linen sat in the wooden boat. They reached the hull of the Roman ship and climbed the rope ladder, their leather sandals scraping against the wet wood. Theodotus of Chios, a cunning rhetorician representing the political interests of the Egyptian court, and Pothinus the eunuch, stepped onto the deck. Pothinus carried a woven basket. As the sea birds shrieked above the mainmast and the rigging groaned under the weight of the wind, Pothinus set the basket on the deck planks. He removed the lid, reached inside, and pulled out a grotesque offering intended to buy the favor of Rome. It was the severed head of Pompey the Great, accompanied by his heavy gold signet ring. The ring had sealed 1,000 dispatches and treaties and private letters across the decades of Pompey's greatness. The Egyptian court expected gratitude. They received a terrifying silence. The waves rocked the boat. The wood groaned under the heavy boots of the legionaries. The sky remained cloudless. The sun burned the back of the neck. How does the ultimate victor react to the mutilated remains of his enemy? The historical record splinters at this precise moment. Caesar looked at the brow of the man who had shared the rule of Rome. The wind pushed his red cloak against his greaves. He turned his back to the envoys, walked to the edge of the ship, and stared into the water where the foam churned against the hull. He pressed the heel of his palm against his brow, and as a tremor passed through his shoulders, he pulled the fabric of his toga over his head. The later moral biographies of Plutarch and the annalistic history of Cassius Dio note the conqueror's reaction. His response was one of profound, physical aversion. Upon receiving the signet ring, he wept. Curiously, in Caesar's own military commentaries, De Bello Civili, there is a deafening silence. He omits his emotional state entirely. Modern historians, however, view this encounter through a lens of pragmatic skepticism. They argue that these tears may have been a calculated act of political theater. By weeping for his rival, Caesar effectively distanced himself from an unpopular murder. He secured the moral high ground while conveniently reaping the ultimate political benefit of Pompey's demise. But it cannot account for what Caesar did next. He ordered his men to seek out Pompey's officers and companions who had been arrested by Ptolemy's forces. Caesar extended his friendship and personal protection to every one of them. He wrote to his friends in Rome, and the letter survives in summary in Plutarch. Of all the rewards of his victory, one gave him the most pleasure. It was that he was so often able to save the lives of fellow citizens who had fought against him. But the geopolitical reaction was absolute. This profound grief, whether genuine or performed, laid bare a rigid Roman paradox. Pompey was, above all else, Caesar's most dangerous political enemy. Yet he was also a Roman citizen, a former son-in-law bound by the tragic memory of Caesar's daughter Julia, and a peer possessing the highest dignitas. To the Roman mind, executing a Roman proconsul on a foreign beach was an intolerable violation of sovereignty and amicitia, the formal concept of Roman friendship. It was an unacceptable inversion of the natural order for a client state to execute a Roman titan. Using this perceived desecration as his absolute justification, the Roman swords were drawn. The logic of the Basileia. Caesar disembarked with approximately 3,200 infantry and 800 cavalry. In the sweeping scale of Roman history, it was a modest force, but numbers do not merely represent manpower. They project immense political weight. Preceded by his lictors holding high the fasces, Caesar marched directly through the streets of Alexandria. The fasces were the ancient bundles of rods and axes that symbolized the absolute power of the Roman magistrate. It was a blatant, calculated signal of Roman sovereignty over the sovereign soil of the Ptolemies. The foreign Roman magistrates brazenly enforced their authority in the sacred streets of the Egyptian capital. The shocking sight deeply outraged the proud local populace, instantly sparking violent riots and deep, simmering resentment. But Caesar was unmoved. The Roman boots hit the stone of Alexandria. Caesar executed a tactical displacement, marching his forces directly into the royal quarter. His legionaries formed a perimeter around the Ptolemaic palace, driving wooden stakes into the ground and piling sandbags against the iron gates. Caesar transformed his vulnerability into a sudden, unyielding stronghold. Academic archives largely agree that this occupation was necessitated by a pragmatic concern: debt. The Ptolemaic crown owed Rome a staggering 6,000 talents, a sum capable of funding legions and securing dominance back in the Republic. Caesar, exhausted by the civil war and commanding a dangerously small force of 4,000 men, cannot afford to leave Egypt empty-handed. Citing the will of the previous ruler, Ptolemy XII Auletes, Caesar declared himself the official arbitrator of the dynastic struggle. He demanded that the boy king Ptolemy XIII and his exiled sister, Cleopatra VII, disband their armies. Inside, the marble halls absorbed the heat of the day. The statues of the old pharaohs cast long shadows across the mosaic floors. Roman sentries stood at the archways, holding their pila vertical. Sweat ran down their necks under bronze helmets. Dust motes drifted in the shafts of sunlight. The palace smelled of old incense. The Ptolemaic palace was a labyrinth of alabaster columns, lotus-carved archways, and shadowed corridors stretching along the Lochias promontory. It was here that Pothinus initiated a weaponized legal blockade. The eunuch possessed no legions that could match the hardened veterans of the Sixth, but he commanded the invisible machinery of the Egyptian state. He had managed Ptolemy's finances. He had managed Ptolemy's education. He had managed the council that decided to kill Pompey, had been, Plutarch records, the most influential person at the court. Pothinus weaponized the last will and testament of Ptolemy XII Auletes, a document deposited years prior in the Roman treasury. The will mandated joint rule between the boy king Ptolemy XIII and his older sister, Cleopatra, under the guardianship of Rome. Cleopatra had already been deposed, driven into exile by Pothinus and the Alexandrian mob. Pothinus approached Caesar in the palace atrium, carrying rolls of papyrus. He cited treaties, local bylaws, and centuries of Alexandrian tradition. The eunuch pointed out that Caesar's presence as a military occupier violated the sovereignty guaranteed by Pompey himself. He began his campaign against Caesar through the household. The soldiers' grain rations arrived at the palace kitchens in the worst condition the granaries held. It was old stock, the kind that fills a man's gut without feeding him. He politely informed the dictator that the royal granaries were empty. He added that their contents had been requisitioned for the defense of the realm according to municipal statute. The official state dinners used wooden dishes and earthenware cups. These were the very meals at which Caesar sat across from the court officials he was supposedly arbitrating between. When Caesar's officers noted this, Pothinus said that the Romans had taken all the gold and silver in debt payment and would have to make do. The strangulation became physical. The water flowing into the palace cisterns through the subterranean canals suddenly turned brackish. Pothinus had ordered the fresh water diverted and seawater pumped into the Roman quarters through the city's intricate hydraulic valves. It was a bloodless assassination. Caesar was isolated inside a golden cage, stripped of logistical support, and surrounded by a hostile metropolis. The heat inside the palace grew oppressive. Roman legionaries were reduced to digging frantic trenches in the palace courtyards, searching for groundwater. These were the very men who had conquered Gaul and broken the Republic. The Mediterranean sun beat down on the marble tiles. The air tasted of salt. Pothinus walked the corridors freely, offering mock apologies and citing administrative delays for the lack of provisions. Outside the heavy stone walls, the native army of Achilles massed. 20,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, composed of Roman renegades, runaway slaves, and mercenaries, stood in formation. The mob built barricades across the intersecting avenues of the city. Spears bristled in the narrow streets, and the shields of the Egyptian infantry formed a solid wall of bronze. The siege began. They determined, more importantly, to prevent the exiled Cleopatra from ever returning to state her case before the Roman dictator. If Caesar attacked, he violated the sacred hospitality of the crown and would face the wrath of the entire East. If he remained, his army would die of thirst. The Roman dictator was being systematically dismantled by clerks. He needed an anomaly. He needed an entity that could shatter the legal architecture of Pothinus' siege. Caesar was subjected to insult upon insult, the rotten grain, the wooden dishes, and Pothinus' own unbroken self-satisfaction. Through it all, Caesar was quietly conducting a second operation. He had written to Cleopatra. The message was short. The message was private. No record preserves its exact words, but its effect is well documented. Cleopatra had been living in exile outside the city, commanding an army she could not deploy against her own brother's forces. The 21-year-old queen received Caesar's message and immediately moved. The Stromatodesmos. Night fell over the delta. The cicadas clicked relentlessly in the royal gardens. Inside the vast chamber of polished porphyry, a solitary oil lamp burned on an oak table. Caesar sat tracing the lines of a parchment map with an iron stylus, scratching the dried animal skin. He mapped the placement of the Roman galleys, calculated the dwindling grain supplies, and measured the distance to the sea. The armor weighed heavily on his chest. Outside, the harbor waters turned black. Camped near Pelusium and exiled from her own capital, Cleopatra VII orchestrated one of the most audacious diplomatic maneuvers in antiquity. Knowing she could not march an army through the streets, she traveled by small boat under the cover of darkness. The boat, its oars wrapped in thick cloth, touched the stone steps of the palace watergate. Apollodorus the Sicilian, a man of vast shoulders, stepped out. He reached into the boat and lifted a heavy burden. For centuries, 19th-century romanticized art depicted the queen unrolling from a lavish, brightly woven carpet. The ancient voices tell a far more rugged tale. The Greek historian Plutarch, writing more than a century and a half after the event, uses the specific term Stromatodesmos. This was not a decorative rug, but a large, sturdy leather or heavy canvas sack strictly used for tying up and carrying ordinary bed linens. It was a gritty, life or death gamble. Apollodorus hoisted the heavy, unremarkable bundle onto his right shoulder. He approached the Roman guards. The Roman guards at the post lowered their spears. The iron tips pointed directly at Apollodorus' chest. He did not flinch. He spoke in broken Latin. He stated he carried a gift for the Roman imperator. The centurion squeezed the fabric. It yielded like thick wool. It felt like ordinary textiles. The night air hung still. The guards let the Sicilian pass. His bare feet slapped the polished stone as he climbed the grand staircase, passing the painted murals of Isis and Osiris. He reached the heavy wooden doors of the study. Two elite veterans blocked the path. Their faces bore the scars of the Gallic campaigns. Apollodorus set the bundle upright on the floor. He gestured to the wood. The senior centurion knocked on the timber. A low voice answered from within. The doors opened. Apollodorus placed the bundle carefully on the mosaic floor. The room smelled of melting wax. Caesar did not look up from the map. His iron stylus continued to scratch the parchment. Apollodorus untied the hemp ropes and pulled the edge of the fabric. The coarse fibers scraped against the smooth tiles, generating a faint hiss. The bundle unrolled, spinning across the colored stones with a dull rushing sound. A figure spilled from the center of the wool. The body hit the floor with a soft thud. Cleopatra VII stood up. Her bare feet pressed against the mosaic. She wore no gold ornaments, no heavy headdress, only a simple linen tunic wrinkled from the journey. Her hair fell unbraided. She breathed in, the scent of heavy myrrh cutting through the smell of the burning oil. The iron stylus rested on the map. Caesar lifted his head. His eyes locked on the woman. She did not kneel. The fabric of her tunic whispered against her legs as she stopped at the edge of the oak table. She met his gaze. The sword and the serpent collided in the silence. Plutarch says Caesar was overcome by her charm as he grew to know her better. Cassius Dio recorded what followed in 2 sentences. Caesar, upon seeing her and hearing her speak a few words, was so completely captivated. At once, he sent for Ptolemy before dawn and tried to reconcile them. As the historian Cassius Dio noted, Cleopatra masterfully deployed her brilliant beauty and intellectual charm. These were not mere vanity, but highly calibrated psychological weapons. Unlike the rigid, honor-bound diplomacy of the Romans, her approach was intoxicatingly fluid. This midnight meeting was not merely the romantic tryst so often depicted in later mythology. It was, at its core, a clandestine, high-stakes diplomatic pact forged in the desperate fires of mutual necessity. She did not ask for a rescue. She offered Caesar exactly what he lacked: a legitimate, co-ruling pharaoh who could ensure the grain supply and the payment of the 6,000 talents. She reached out a hand. Her fingertips grazed the edge of the parchment map. The boundary of Rome shifted under her touch. The dictator did not pull the map away. He breathed out, the breath moving the flame of the oil lamp. An unbreakable alliance forged in the narrow space between their hands. It was a merging of desperate ambition and calculated survival. Caesar himself, in his own military commentaries on the Civil War, entirely omits this legendary personal anecdote. Writing to justify his actions to a skeptical Roman Senate, Caesar strips the narrative of its political unorthodoxy. His De Bello Civili remains strictly focused on troop movements, military logistics, and the dry facts of the occupation. But he allows the spectacular arrival of the Egyptian queen to remain a silent mystery in his own words. But in this silent room, they spoke in low voices over the parchment. No swords were drawn. The fracture of empires. The sky outside the high windows turned gray. Morning light struck the Pharos lighthouse, turning the limestone pale yellow. The seagulls resumed their shrieks above the harbor. Inside the palace, the heavy wooden doors opened. Caesar walked out into the corridor wearing his red military cloak. Cleopatra walked beside him with the measured pace of a monarch. The Roman centurions snapped to attention, their hobnailed boots striking the stone, breathing in the scent of myrrh. The political landscape had been irrevocably altered. The boy king received the summons in his quarters. He knew what the summons meant the moment he heard it. The young Ptolemy XIII entered the Roman-held quarters and discovered his hated sister standing beside the dictator. In that instant, the boy king realized the full gravity of the shift. In a paroxysm of betrayal, he tore the royal diadem from his head and stormed out into the streets in a violent rage. It was the final, irrevocable break within the Ptolemaic court, the spark that ignited the brutal Alexandrian war. Beyond the palace walls, Pothinus the eunuch stood by a fountain, looking up at the high balcony. He saw the Roman dictator and the sovereign queen. The morning wind blew the dust across the barricades. Within the claustrophobic confines of a besieged palace, the smuggled queen weaponized the element of surprise. She completely transformed herself from a hunted fugitive, marked for death, into the Basilissa, an architect of a new world order. For Caesar, the encounter forced a necessary pivot. He turned away from the mourning of a fractured Roman past, as embodied by Pompey's signet ring. He anchored his legions, instead, to the promise of a Greco-Egyptian future. The collision of these two titans, behind locked doors, forever altered the map of the ancient world. The carpet lay empty on the study floor. The dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight. And outside, the sea continued to hit the stone steps of the harbor, remaining entirely indifferent to the changed borders of the earth. Somewhere in the Roman archives, there is a gap. Caesar wrote obsessively. Dispatches, commentaries, letters, the man documented everything. The crossing of the Rhine. The invasion of Britain. The march on Rome. Every battle, every negotiation, every political calculation that shaped the Republic's collapse. His scribes worked by lamplight in every camp he ever occupied. In the pages of De Bello Civili, the night of October 2nd does not exist. The bundle is not mentioned. The woman is not mentioned. Caesar, who left a written record of almost everything, said nothing. He never explained how.